All right. So next up, we've got Kai from Arizona. I believe that I'm pronouncing that correctly. What's up there, Kai?
Hey, Mr. Godless Engineer, and I'm sorry I didn't catch the other host's name. Who else am I speaking to this evening?
Call me Dave.
Fitzgerald.
Dave, pleasure to talk to you, Dave. And I saw the topic. I'm very interested in discussing one of the big piece of evidence that makes me feel like there was an underlying creature, probably called Yeshua, that lived around the time that the alleged Jesus of Nazareth lived. Can I go ahead and present my line of thinking, and you can tell me what I'm maybe missing or got wrong?
Definitely.
Sure.
Okay. So I think most folks would acknowledge, and you can jump in and tell me if I got it wrong. I know you will. Most folks would acknowledge that the prophecies about Messiah indicated he was going to be from the city of David, from Bethlehem, and there's a whole bunch of them that you could go look up. I'm sure you're all familiar with them.
Well, there are also
prophecies.
Not
say again?
About other places. Yeah. There are also other prophecies you could point to if you were...
Micah chapter 5 is one example that describes that the ruler that's going to deliver Israel from the hands of invaders is going to be from Bethlehem. Anyway,
right. But I think what David's trying to point out is that there are also other prophecies and other understandings and maybe even some scripture that we don't even have now that could point in a different direction as far as the birthplace of Christ. There's several scholarly discussions happening around this particular topic. So.
Right.
Oh, sure, yeah. I'm not even arguing.
This in my book.
I actually don't. My best guess is not that Christ was born in Bethlehem. That's kind of where I'm going with this. I believe that
that's
there was.
Right. It's the whole Nazareth versus Bethlehem thing that Hitchens brought up, right? Kai?
Yeah. So why? May I briefly summarize it for any viewers that aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So the idea is that there was a guy called Jesus of Nazareth, who was very well known, Jesus of Nazareth, and he went around teaching and made a name for himself, being an apocalyptic rabbi, and then he was executed by the Romans for whatever he was executed for, and his followers went on to start Christianity, revolving around this Jesus of Nazareth character. But then in order to make him the Messiah, they shoehorned in a Bethlehem birth narrative that didn't actually happen, just because nobody would believe that he was the Messiah if they said he was born in Nazareth. So they kind of, shoehorned in the Bethlehem thing. Is that about the long and short how you understand it?
Yeah, that's a good way of... Go ahead, John.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, David. I was just I've got several questions that come up whenever somebody brings up the whole Nazareth thing. I'm personally not convinced by the Nazareth situation because of the fact that we've got Peter Parker from New York City. We know New York City exists, so therefore there must have been a Peter Parker to base the comic book on, or you could pick any other fictional character from our history, and just because they're said to have come from a place, that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually did come from that place or that they actually existed in the first place.
Let me jump in, John.
May I? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll wait until David's done, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Kai. One thing that Hitchens points out is, for him, he says the bare fact that of the how did he call it? The hoax of it that this guy was clearly born in Nazareth and everybody knew it, but Scripture said he had to be from Bethlehem. Well, the fact is, in fact, that our first gospel that all the other gospels were written on doesn't say that he's from Nazareth. It calls him a Nazarene or a Nazorian. It's a sect title, not a place title, and I discussed that in the book quite a bit. And the fact is, there was scriptures that said he shall be born in Bethlehem. Like you said, they had to kind of be tweaked to make it born in Bethlehem because it's actually talking about out of the tribe of and not necessarily a place. But there was also scripture that could point to Nazareth because of Netzer, the word Netzer being a branch of David. There was scripture that makes it sound like Mark actually thought that he was born in Canaan or Capernaum. And that's where his idea of where Jesus really came from. So it's one of many examples where everything that we all know about Jesus turns to be hinged on something that doesn't quite mean that originally or in the beginning. And we can play that game with everything in Jesus, from his birth to his death and everything in between. There's lots of things that we take for granted about, and you mentioned it yourself, even the fact that Jesus was killed by the Romans for some reason, but nothing in his trial makes sense from a Hebrew standpoint. Absolutely nothing historically makes sense in that, from his arrest to his execution. Even Bart Ehrman says this too. It's like all the secular reconstructions of Jesus's life, one thing they can't explain, including the fact that he was a failed apocalyptic prophet, is why would the Romans care? Why would they kill him because he said he was the Jewish Messiah? That wasn't even illegal by Jewish law. Calling yourself the Messiah wasn't blasphemy. If it was blasphemy, they would have just taken him out and thrown rocks at him until he was dead, and that would have been the end of that. There's just no reason, and Bart Ehrman says the same thing about his failed apocalyptic prophet model, that it doesn't really explain why the Romans would care. And to be fair, neither do the Gospels. Nothing the Gospels say about that makes sense either, historically.
Thank you for that response. That's actually very informative, and I hadn't realized the distinction between him being called originally Nazarene, not necessarily Jesus of Nazareth. I didn't realize that distinction, so that's definitely something new I'm taking away. And
I appreciate that.
There's a whole
constellation.
The thing that I get hung up on is that you're making a positive affirmative claim by saying an individual didn't exist, and that seems to me to be a rather lofty claim to suggest that in a part of the world that there was not a guy named Yeshua in Galilee at that time period. I mean, that's
you may have missed the beginning of the talk when I was saying, well, there's nothing implausible about there being a guy named Yeshua. We have lots of Yeshuas. We have lots of failed messiahs of the first century. Nothing's improbable about Jesus being another one of those guys. Nothing. It's just that when we look at his life, our evidence for what we know about him just boils down fewer and fewer. And the more you look at it, the less it looks like anything that we think of as biographical information for Jesus holds up when you kick the tires. And
I think that we're sort of in agreement, because I don't believe he was the Messiah or performed miracles or did any particular thing that he's attributed to have done, or said anything he's attributed to have said in the four Gospels that were written at least decades later. I don't believe any of that to be true. I'm just saying that there very likely was, a loud, itinerant apocalyptic preacher named Yeshua that traveled around Galilee and may have been executed. I mean, the Romans executed lots of people for lots of reasons, and if there was a preacher that was getting a lot of clout and maybe being called King of the Jews, that might be a good reason for Rome to execute him.
Kai, if I can jump in real quick here. The first thing I want to address is that it's not like we're saying that he 100% did not exist. And, David bringing up that it's perfectly plausible for just some random Jewish rabbi to be going around is a plausible explanation. That means that we're not saying that it's 100% like he didn't exist. We're saying most likely, given the current evidence that we have, he probably didn't exist. And the reason why we say that is, I'm not trying to talk for David or anything, but at least the reason why I say he most likely didn't exist is because there's no solid evidence to suggest that he did exist. And so it doesn't tip me in the direction of historicity. So when you say that, that there most likely was a person walking around, I would need to see evidence for that. Like, what evidence tips it in that direction? And it's definitely not the whole Nazareth thing.
Especially considering that we do have evidence. We do have evidence for all these other.
May I briefly respond to Godless Engineer?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so it's a rather banal claim, though. If I were to tell you that there exists a dog named Rover somewhere in Texas, I don't have any evidence to back that up, but you wouldn't need evidence to accept that. You would shrug it off and say there probably isn't. Who cares?
Well, that's not the claim, though. The specific claim that we're talking about is that there was a very specific person that started Christianity, that influenced like Paul and the other early apostles, that caused Christianity to come into existence. That's the specific claim. Now, I mean, if you were to say, oh, well, there really was a real dog named Lassie that rescued a Timmy from the well using only his barks to communicate, with the local farmer dude, I feel like that's a little bit closer to the claim of Christianity being, this very specific Jewish rabbi that influenced all these things.
And let me jump in real fast, John, just to dovetail on that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, and it's just that, there's nothing implausible about Jesus just being one of those many failed apocalyptic prophets of the first century. The thing is, we have evidence for those guys. We have evidence for several of those guys. And yet, none of them did anything as remarkable as what Jesus does in the Gospels. And yet, they made a dent in the historical record, and Jesus didn't. That's one of the things that makes me wonder about, that's weird. But it's also the fact that everything we look at the biographically about Jesus, anything that we try to pin down what he really did and really said, anytime we do that, we're left with the same vanishing bit of evidence. And the more it looks like before the Gospels are written that he's just another celestial Messiah, that he's a mystery faith figure, and he gradually became historicized, not the other way around. So, and again, it's no skin off our backs.
A question about then why, if he was a whole cloth invention that was a completely fictitious character that was invented by perhaps the disciple, perhaps perhaps the Apostle Paul, somebody invented this character, or a group of people invented this character. Why not call him Jesus of Bethlehem? Why invent him from the wrong? Why make him up whole cloth and have them originate from the wrong town?
Well, we don't even know in the first book where he came. The original story, the original gospel, starts in his age 30, showing up to be baptized in the Gospel of Mark. Mark didn't care about things like that. He didn't care about, there was no idea of a virgin birth in Mark. He didn't even have Jesus start out as God. His Jesus started out as just a plain, ordinary guy who God adopted at his baptism. And because he was so faithful to God's promises and went all the way through it, even to be crucified for him, at his death, he became exalted and became Lord. Total.
But you see that sort of speaks to my point a little bit more, to suggest that the earliest stories had Jesus coming from Nazareth, and it wasn't until later authors like Matthew and Luke.
Kai, that's not what I'm saying. Matthew and Luke are not the earliest stories. They all base theirs.
I understand.
Yeah, nobody before Matthew and Luke says that he came from Nazareth. Not even Mark.
Well, Mark does say that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. Mark doesn't say anything about Bethlehem. Bethlehem's invented with Matthew's gospel.
Right. Sorry, I stand corrected.
If Mark or Mark's sources or the other religious leaders were inventing a fictitious character to be the face of their movement, why not call him Jesus of Bethlehem? If he doesn't exist, you can make him Jesus of Beijing, China. But you're mixing Kai, you're mixing up different things here. The first gospel that we have does not mention Bethlehem. So it makes no sense to be like, hey, why not call him Jesus from Bethlehem? Because Mark, our earliest gospel that provides biographical information about Jesus, doesn't mention that. It does mention Nazareth, but I mean, I understand. I feel like I'm doing a poor job of explaining my point here. In my head, it makes a lot more sense than what I'm saying out loud. I'm trying to say that Mark calls him Jesus of Nazareth. The Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem. If Mark or Mark's sources were making him up.
Hi, let me stop you there. You say the scriptures said he was supposed to come from Bethlehem. Some scriptures could be interpreted that way. Other Jews said other things.
Okay, I think that's where my hang up is.
For that.
And Paul,
not the only game in town.
And Paul, and if you want to get to like the nitty gritty of the like historical evidence, our earliest historical evidence doesn't talk about Jesus's birth at all. which would be Paul's letters.
Right.
Paul never mentions him coming from any city or town. So, I mean, like, if you're questioning, like, why not call him Jesus from here or there? Why call him Jesus from anywhere in the first place? Because apparently it didn't matter.
And Paul acts as if he never was on earth at all.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And Paul acts as if he was
I'm
never on earth at all.
The point on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I apologize. The delay has got me messed up. I'm happy to concede the point that David made, that there are many different scriptures that describe a Messiah emerging from many different places. So it's not like they had a hard fast, he must be from Bethlehem. So anyone we're going to say is the Messiah, we have to shoehorn in a Bethlehem story just to make it legit. So I will. I'm going to get off the line now so that you can move on to other callers. But I do want to end with one question, and I'll take the response over YouTube or wherever I'm watching. But perhaps David can speak to this. At what point and for what reason would Matthew and Luke or other traditions have decided to add in a previously non-existent Bethlehem story? Like, why did they decide to add that in, when writing their accounts, or where did they get that from? Thank you guys for taking my call. I'll listen to your response, and have a wonderful evening, guys. Thank you.
You too. Those are really good questions he brings up. And he asks, why did Matthew and Luke bother? Well, they added a lot of things to Mark's. Mark's first gospel is our most low rent, no frills, stripped down gospel, most fallible Jesus. So they had lots of things they wanted to say and improve on the gospel. They weren't setting out to write the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Luke. They were all setting out to write the one true gospel. So Matthew is constantly correcting Mark's mistakes. Luke is acting like, he says in the very beginning of his gospel, so many people are writing gospels now, it seemed like a good idea for me to go out and research the story from the beginning as it's been handed down to our generation and give you the real scoop. And then he steals his story mostly from Mark and Matthew and passes his stuff as his own. But the birth stories and the birth stories in Luke, those are two completely different stories that don't match up at all. They do not sync at all, and neither of them makes sense on its own. So there's all kinds of reasons they were adding more. John, when he makes his gospel and it comes around later, he doesn't even try to match up with the other guys. He doesn't even have parables. He has Jesus being crucified for a completely different reason that's not even in the other books. And all four of the books, they are just as filled with small little details that seem realistic but they're complete contradiction to each other.
Right, and I wonder if maybe it would help Kai in understanding where we're coming from, is if he were to understand that it's not like there was a unified Christian like group, right? So
Absolutely.
you've got Mark's group of Christians that wrote the gospel that we know now as Mark, and then you had a separate group of Christians that redacted Mark into Matthew, and added some things and took some things out, or didn't put some things in there or whatever, and then Luke was a different group who were trying to write their own gospel, and then John, of course, was also another group. So you had all these different groups that were working together. And see, the thing is that each one of these groups have different scriptures that they take as being like the scriptures about the Messiah.
Right.
And
these are just the four that made the official cut. We still have gospels like the Gospel of Peter that was way more popular than the Gospel of Mark during its day. There were scads of gospels and acts and letters of Paul that never made the cut because for one reason or another. We're only seeing a tiny tip of the Christian iceberg when it comes to early Christian writings.
Right. And I think that it would help him if he, instead of thinking it as one cohesive unit, you think of it as these different Christian groups that were going around, and each one of them had their own set of scriptures that they considered to be about the Messiah, which, if anybody is interested, this is called like Pesher creation, like the creation of Peshers, taking individual verses out of the Old Testament to reveal new information, specifically in this case about the Messiah, I think is kind of what fueled those differences.
And Matthew's constantly doing that, saying, oh, and this was done in order to fulfill this or that prophecy, even when he's talking about prophecies that don't exist or are not saying what he says they say. He's constantly saying this is a midrashic thing. Saying this was done to fulfill a prophecy when it's just being midrashic, I should say.
Which I mean, this kind of leads me in a direction, and the direction it leads me in is that if you had all of these different groups, and we know that there were different groups of Christians going around, that's not just some wild-haired claim. If there were these different groups, and they were having to use the scriptures to know things about Jesus, it kind of makes me question, like, oh, well, was there really even a Jesus in the first place? Like, if there really was, you would think that they would just be able to refer to the information that they knew instead of having to refer to the scriptures.
And yet Paul constantly acts like no one would know about Jesus whatsoever if it weren't for preachers like him. And everything he knows about Jesus, he was taught it by no man. No one told him this. It came from his reading of scripture and personal revelation. He didn't even tell us the story about the road to Damascus story. Luke tells it 3 times. Paul never says anything remotely like that. And before, because one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and I think this kind of bears in mind to say, is talking about the mystery faiths, the Hellenistic mystery faiths. Christianity seems to be a Jewish version of the mystery faiths. And we see that in the way Paul uses the terminology. We see that in verses like Mark 4:11, where Jesus is talking about how I teach in parables, that way those outside the circle, they won't turn from their sins and be saved. Only you guys will be, because you'll understand it. That makes no sense from the Jesus we grew up with, the Jesus we're talked about in Christianity. It makes perfect sense if we're talking about a mystery faith where you have to be in the club to get the salvation, like the Gospel of Thomas. You have to know his secret teachings to be saved. It hasn't have anything to do with him being crucified for anybody's sins.
I think the caller that we just had was Kai was mostly trying to make the argument that is essentially the reason why Christopher Hitchens rejected mythicism, the suspicion that there was some sort of competence amongst these people as they were collaborating to make the story up. Meanwhile, like the whole Old Testament, I think it's really funny when people are like, what, you really think they would just make someone up though? And it's like, yeah, I know. Like, you mean like Abraham or like Noah or like Moses or like Adam or like all those people. But you're saying they're going to make up something and they put somebody in the wrong place that he shouldn't be. Oh, you mean like Jews in Egypt during a time where there weren't Jews in Egypt and they're slaves during a time that there was no such thing as Egyptian Hebrew slaves? Like, yeah, no, crazy.
Unless we are not making fun of you, Kai. Those were great questions, and those are awesome questions and good thoughts.
I'm making fun of little. No, I'm kidding. I'm not.
But these are all good questions, and I talk about them in my book, Jesus Mything in Action, which I should plug at some point here, because that book was written for atheists who aren't down with mythicism, and these were the reasons why that I'm not a historicist, where it makes more sense to me that this came out from a completely different direction, that our Jesus was created as a mystery faith figure and became historicized.